Welcome to the Time to Practice podcast. This is a space where we talk about music practice, the ups and downs that young musicians go through related to practice and learning music, and how we as parents, caregivers, and music educators can support the young musicians in our lives, support ourselves, and support each other. My name is Christine Goodner. I'm a music educator, author, and podcaster who has made it my mission to talk about music practice and to support educators and families looking to make home practice more effective and to reduce conflict and frustration in the practice room. I'm glad you're here. This episode is brought to you by my recent session about supporting students with developing attention and focus in the practice room and in music lessons. We covered frequently reported pain points by teachers, parents, and students, helpful information to know about attention and focus, some additional information about ADHD that's helpful for parents and teachers to know, and specific strategies that can help in music practice and music lessons. If you'd like access to the recorded video and the audio-only file, along with some resources that I sent out after the talk, you can find a link to purchase those on my website or in the show notes. I hope this resource supports you, and I appreciate you supporting the work of this podcast anytime you purchase one of my resources. You're listening to episode 122. Today, I wanted to talk about something that may seem on the surface to be a very Suzuki-specific topic, but I think understanding this challenge gives us insight into students of all levels and learning through all methods. Even if we are not learning by ear, as young Suzuki students do, we also listen to practice assignments from our teachers and listen to instructions and use listening to learn in other ways. So hopefully you'll find this relevant to you, whichever method your child is learning in or whichever method you teach. I wanted to talk about this topic because often I see advice in online Suzuki parenting and teaching groups and posts that go something like this. My child or my student is struggling to learn new pieces, to make progress, to play musically, to learn the form of XYZ piece. And often there is a lot of advice that is simply have them listen more as the default answer, or they are not listening enough. And at first glance, I couldn't agree with this advice more. If you listened to last week's episode or read my article in the most recent American Suzuki Journal, you already know that I consider listening one of the foundational ways we make progress in the Suzuki method. It's how we internalize music, how we play from the inside out, and it's how we, in practical fashion, can learn music like a language, like Suzuki envisioned. It can be frustrating, though, to hear this advice as a standalone answer when we are listening and we still see struggles happening. It can feel invalidating or like we are not being heard or listened to if everyone keeps telling us to listen more or have our students listen more and we feel they're already going above and beyond in the listening and we are asking for ideas beyond that. It's a bit like going to the doctor with a complaint and them telling us to do what we are already doing and not having any further advice for us, or really not listening to us when we say, oh, we're doing that already. The recommendation can be a great idea, but what if we are already doing that? Then what? Michelle Horner, a Suzuki guitar teacher, has a fantastic video from a number of years ago from the Parents as Partners series that the Suzuki Association of the Americas used to put on. And she advocated for listening to your current piece and your most recent piece and your next piece 10 times a day on a rotation. And that has really helped her own child and one of her students zoom ahead with their progress when they were feeling stuck. And I have seen that work for my own students as well. So I would definitely try that approach before deciding you're listening enough already. However much you're listening, it might be what your teacher's already recommended. And it could be that your particular child, or if your teacher, your particular student needs to be immersed in even more intensive listening. So please try that approach as step one. I also have seen cases where people say, yes, we're listening, but then struggle to really say when or how they are listening. And they realize on some reflection, it's not happening as much as they think it is. They feel like they know the concept, they mean to listen, but is it actually happening? So that's my second tip is to really take stock first and be honest with ourselves. How much is actually happening? Do a listening tracking challenge for your own self as the adult who's putting on the recording or making sure your child's putting it on for themselves for a week or two and really take stock of what's going on to see if in practice the listening is actually happening as much as we think it is. But let's say hypothetically that much listening is happening and still a student is struggling to learn or internalize their music. What could be going on or what else might help us support their learning? Or what could be helpful to know, we might say, so we could see what factors could be getting in the way. So I want to give three possibilities and say very clearly there certainly could be more. I find when I see these discussions in online posts, it's hard for me to put my thoughts into a short, concise online comment. So maybe making this episode will also help me organize my thoughts so I can better communicate what I want to say about it as well. If you have something to add to this, please reach out. I'd love to hear what else you would put on this list of ways we could help. So, first on my list is attention. Perhaps there is something about attention and focus on what we're listening to that could be getting in the way of our learning. We could be playing the recording of our child's current piece for them many times a day, but it could be the case that while it's playing, their mind is wandering and their attention is drawn to something else. So, what their ears are hearing, their brain is not actually focusing in on enough that they are able to internalize the music. A few weeks ago, I held a live session on focus and attention. You probably heard the little ad at the beginning of this episode, which helps support this podcast existing. And we talked a little bit about how we can shine our attention flashlight, which is a concept I have heard Tara Sumter talk about a lot. She came on the podcast earlier this season. I'll put a link to her episode in the show notes. And also from Dr. Amishi Jha, who wrote the book Peak Mind. Both of these experts talk about there being an attention flashlight. We can imagine when we put our focused attention on something that we are shining a flashlight on it to bring our attention to that one point. And what I have learned about this attention flashlight is we can shine it on one place at a time. So if our child is thinking a lot about what's going on inside their body, what happened earlier in the day, a conversation going on in the other room, there could be endless possibilities of where that attention flashlight is. Maybe it's not on the music that is playing in the background for them at that moment. Maybe we're playing the music in the background around the house, but there's lots of other activity going on or lots of other sounds going on. And the music is just not catching our child's attention in a detail oriented way enough that it is transferring over to their learning of their particular piece at this moment. We could be taking in something else. We could be distracted by something else. Our brain could be laser focused on something, and we're totally blocking out the sounds around us, including the recording that our parent is diligently playing for us in the background. So this attention issue is related to the second idea I wanted to share, which is maybe for our particular child, passive listening alone to their recording is not going to be enough to help them with their learning. There's a really helpful article on edutopia.com by educator Daniel Vollrath on 5 strategies to improve student listening skills. I will include that link in the show notes. These listening skills that were talked about in this article are more about like listening in a classroom setting, but I think the idea is one we can transfer over into our learning in music. So in this article, he writes that active listening involves listening, but also reacting and responding based on what we hear. And we may need to hear our piece many times and then add a layer of reacting or responding to it. In my mind, this could be things like listen to the piece and keep a beat or march around the room to a beat. Listen to our piece and draw a picture of what we might imagine the music being about. Talking to our practice parent or grown up or our teacher about what we notice about the music after we listen. Maybe being able to hum the tune or be able to hum the tune that comes next after a certain section that we already know how to play. Maybe to write our own lyrics that match up with the melody or a certain chunk that's tricky for us to learn. I want to be clear, this is different than teaching students lyrics so they can learn the piece. It's having them listen and hear and understand the tune enough that they can come up with their own lyrics because they have internalized the music. Of course, different students are going to find different suggestions on that list more appealing or more helpful than others. But I do think that list is worth working through as an experiment to see what might connect with your child or what might help them better internalize the music that they are about to learn. And then that's related to the third area, which is being able to recall what we heard. So hearing is one function in our bodies or brains, but recalling what we've heard, retrieving that out of where our brain has stored the information and then being able to use it is another process completely. And that's much more complicated. So those active listening strategies might give us some great experiences with our listening in a variety of ways, which may help that music we are listening to get stored in our brains for later use. Another great article that I think helps us start thinking about this was on a website called listenwise.com. It was called Difficulties and Strategies in Listening Comprehension. So I'll also share the link to that in the show notes. And in this article, they posted that the biggest challenge with listening and comprehension has three parts. One, difficulty remembering what we've listened to. We'll talk about some reasons why that might be in a moment. Number two is this is geared towards speakers, but being able to understand a speaker's accent or how fast or slow they are speaking. Maybe we could think about this in music terms as slowing down our recording in order for our child to be able to hear the notes or the articulations more clearly. And then third is a limited vocabulary or a limited knowledge about what they are hearing. So this article made the point that focus and attention are really the biggest factor about all three of these things. And they could stem from one of the following. This is like why we might have trouble remembering what we've listened to. It could be that a student has an auditory processing difficulty, perhaps ADHD or another learning disorder. Maybe the speed at which the information is getting communicated is making it difficult to store and recall the information. And again, the author of this article groups all of these into maybe attention issues, but not attention issues as in we need to focus harder or try harder, but there are things getting in the way of our ability to pay attention enough to take things in. So these are not issues that can be solved simply by saying, just listen or just listen more if we're having trouble with our brain processing what we're hearing for various reasons. So the advice in this article about what do we do about this problem included starting with shorter segments of data for the student to take in. So in the Suzuki method, in some ways we do this because we start off with very short pieces that we're listening to and working on learning, and then we work our way up to more complicated or longer pieces of music. But our students may also need help modeling and identifying small chunks to listen to at a time to isolate what they are not catching by listening all the way through. I think of some students I'm currently working with in book 4 who might be listening, but by the time they are in the middle of listening to a Vivaldi violin concerto, maybe their mind is drifting and they're not catching this little segment in the middle. And we might find, okay, here's the minute and seconds where you're going to find this in your recording at home. Let's move to that section and listen there. Maybe even listen and watch the music, point at the notes we're hearing on the page so we can help ourselves track what's going on in a smaller segment. Also, the article gave advice to teach active listening skills. So a more active listening approach that we talked about earlier in this episode, we might just need to teach how to do that. It might feel obvious to us as music teachers that we could break down our listening into a more active participation mode. And we may need to just talk about what that looks like with the students that we work with. And then the third piece of advice this article suggested is to use graphic organizers. So some of us might do this with a twinkle sandwich when we have students learning Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and talk about the bread at the beginning and the middle sections, which are the filling of the sandwich, and then the bread happens again. But for some students of all different ages, we may need to carry that visual organizer of what we are learning forward into more advanced pieces and learning situations. How do we make what we are hearing represented visually for some students that they're really going to need that to take in what we're trying to learn? So I want to be really clear that this episode is not an argument about not listening. I think the more we listen, the more helpful it is, but maybe it's more about how we listen and how we might flesh out our listening in a more rich way for students to take in what they are hearing. It's an argument to look below the surface and give additional tools to families and students so they can add that to their listening practice and their routine to support their learning. It's a when the standard advice is not working, then what kind of conversation. As educators and parents, we can take a step back, maybe simply working on a theory and no clear why behind these tactics are needed, and help support our students with their learning. It's not going to cause any harm to try any of these suggestions with any student. And having all these ideas in our toolbox for our students and their children can be really vital so that those students who really need them in order to be successful have access to them. Again, let's start by just intentionally listening more than we already are, whatever that amount is. Maybe track your listening for a week or two and see, okay, not just what do I intend to happen, what is actually happening with listening at home. Let's keep up the listening log and add up the number of minutes. And then we could just think about increasing how much we're already listening. And then adding in some of these other strategies and thinking about if simply listening is not doing the trick, then what could we do that can help listen more deeply, with more attention, with more active participation, maybe even listening with a visual component alongside of it to help support students' learning. Love to hear what you would add to my thoughts here. And also, if you found anything in this episode helpful and you tried anything and it made a difference, I would love to hear that so I know what is helping and resonating with people. With that, I'm going to send you off into your week of practice and listening. Have a great week, everyone, and take very good care.